Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this month's Classical Wisdom online event on the revolution to come, Thucydides to tomorrow. We've got a really exciting, very pertinent conversation, kind of delving into the history and the ideas of revolution and what that means and how we should view society, I mean, in history, and it's just going to be really exciting. But just to say, as a brief introduction, for those of you who might be new to Classical Wisdom or myself, my name is Anya Leonard, and I'm the founding director of Classical Wisdom. And our mission is to bring ancient wisdom to modern minds and to sort of show the relevance of the classics in our here and now, which just again and again seems to be so pertinent. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this community and again and again, we have these events, and our community is just really wonderful. Thoughtful questions, beautiful engagement. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this classicalism community. Just as a quick order of events, we're going to sort of start off kind of going into the premise of Dan's newest book, and then we will turn to questions afterwards from the audience. Um, and I'll do some introductions. Just first to say also thank you to Sean Kelly, our managing editor, who will be helping in the background as well and helping curate questions that you can add into the chat at any point. So with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Dan Edelstein is the William H. Bonsall Professor of French at Stanford University, where he also holds courtesy appointments in political science and history. An authority on Enlightenment political thought, he intertwines literature, intellectual history, and digital humanities in books such as On the Spirit of Rights and his latest, of which we are speaking about today, The Revolution to Come. Melissa Lane holds the class of 1943 Professorship of Politics at Princeton University and is affiliated with the departments of Classic and Philosophy. A political theorist renowned for reviving ancient ideas for modern debates and author of many books, including The Birth of Politics, 8 Greek and Roman Political Ideas and Why They Matter, and recently The Rule of Office, Plato's Ideas on the Political. Melissa has led Princeton's University Center for Human Values as well. And finally, we have Josh Ober, the Konstantin Mitsotakis Professor of Political Science and Classics at Stanford University, where he investigates how ancient Greek institutions inform contemporary democratic theory. His influential books, From Mass and Elite in Democratic Athens to the Rise and Fall of Classical Greece, have reshaped scholarly and public understandings of democracy's origins and possibilities. So we have some serious heavyweighters in the realm of classical political thought, and it's really just very exciting to have you guys join us. So first, thank you and welcome. And secondly, let's delve right in. And I'm going to turn to Dan first because he's just published this really interesting book on revolutions and sort of the premise of The Revolution to Come, a history of an idea from Thucydides to Lenin. You don't actually set out to chronicle the history of revolution, which you sort of think when you start it that that's what's going to happen, but rather the idea of revolution. So maybe you can kick off the proceedings by telling us why it is important to look at the meaning of revolution.
Well, first, thanks so much, Anya, for hosting this, and thanks so much to Josh and Melissa for joining me. I will say that I speak with a little bit of trepidation when I'm in the presence of such towering giants of classics, especially not even being a classicist myself. So I just needed to get that out there first. I think that, in a way, I did not set out to write a book that started all the way back in Greek antiquity. I was trying to understand something about the French Revolution, which is, where I'm a bit more comfortable in, given that that's my training. And I was really just struggling with this kind of simple question, which is, what makes the French Revolution so distinctive? Why does it seem to usher in a whole new era of revolutionary fervor? Um, Especially given that it's clearly not the first revolution. It comes on the heels of this American Revolution. There's all these connections to it, people, ideas, documents. And yet it turns out so differently. It has a very different dynamic to it. And it's really the French Revolution that serves as this template for so many revolutions to come in the 19th and even the 20th centuries. So that was the question I was trying to answer. And then I had the good fortune of taking Josh's class on the origins of Greek political thought. And it was really in that class where I started to realize that, in a sense, what the French were doing was overturning these ideas of revolution that went back to Thucydides, and particularly, Thucydides' famous description of the stasis and Corcyra, um, and then realizing that those were such influential ideas, not only the just sort of the horrific account of revolution, but then also the answers to, like, how do you avoid that kind of revolution, and the theories of mixed constitutionalism that later Greek authors, especially Polybius, who I focus on in the book, really developed, that sort of body of thought was going to remain, obviously with certain changes, but more or less in place up until, the American Revolution. And so I sort of needed to go all the way back to the Greeks to see, like, where does this other idea of revolution come from? Why does it remain sort of so prominent for centuries, millennia even. And then what is it really about the French idea of revolution that was so different? So that was why I was, focusing more on ideas and not just on sort of revolutions per se as empirical events.
Well, I think it's interesting to see how this idea has changed. And so I want to like bring in our panelists and kind of delve into the full conversation. But I think one more overview, please, if you don't mind, to hold our hands a little bit further into the conversation. Dan, would you be able to give us sort of a brief overview of how the idea of revolution has evolved from being sort of this greatest of all political dangers to sort of a force that has to be harnessed?
The main argument of the book is that what ultimately shifts the idea of revolution from sort of the problem to the solution is, in fact, different conceptions of history. And that the reason why this classical vision of revolution, or the classical phobia of revolution, lasted for so long was because the idea or understanding of history to which it was indexed hadn't really changed, even in a Christian world. Namely, that when, for instance, when you read Thucydides and he goes through the bloody horrors of Corcyra, he sort of ends it by saying, this is always what's going to happen, not, everywhere now and in the future, because human nature is just like this. And so there's this sense of, we're never going to get out of it. We're never going to reach a sort of a better place where we're not, at each other's throats in these moments of political disagreement. And it's only in the 18th century, once you start to get people saying, what, it kind of feels like we've made a lot of progress, and hey, maybe we're just going to keep making progress, and we're eventually going to get to this place where we're all reasonable, and we recognize the same ideas of justice, and we won't have any violence anymore, and it's going to be great. And in that new understanding of history, suddenly revolution, rather than sort of being this interruption into history that just causes death and devastation, becomes more like the portal towards this better, improved world, towards which everyone now wants to arrive.
I think at this point, I'd love for Melissa and Josh to jump in as well, and to kind of comment a bit on this concept of having this two dichotomic ways of looking at history. Do you think which one is more persuasive for understanding political upheaval today? Like, are we this sort of moving forward progressive world, or are we part of this eternal cycle of collapse?
Well, I could kick off. So I think that Dan's really put his finger on something that's really very, very important here, in that there really are two ways to think about what a revolution means. Does it mean social disruption that will ultimately just simply lead to more of the same? So are we in an eternal cycle? Or is there some progress towards an idealized future that justifies a certain amount of violence, disruption, uh, a need to eliminate what is now in order to create what might be? And I think that has to be based on a conception of understanding what the future is going to be in terms of a kind of absolute justice. So if we agree, we the revolutionaries, that we know what justice is, and that the current circumstances are utterly unjust, it does then justify using violence to bring about this better, clearly better, superior, more just world. If we actually think that justice is something that we have to debate, which is the ancient way of thinking about things, then you're much less clear that it is justifiable, indeed desirable, to use revolutionary violence in order to gain a future, which, if we're not sure what justice is, and we're not sure that we're going to get to someplace better, then we're in a much less clear position to say, yes, it's okay to kill people.
Yeah, if I can jump in as well. I mean, I think the book really brings out beautifully how, in a way, the idea of revolution in the modern period starts to play what I would call the role of utopia. It becomes the kind of vision, and it's not just the direction of history. I think Dan's book also shows that it's an idea about people ultimately coming to a common interest. So the idea is that all divisions will be abolished and people will all agree, which also resonates with what Josh was just saying. But I do want to nuance one aspect of the discussion of ancient Greece in the book, because I think it does leave out, or it leaves open the door for what I think was part of what did happen, which was that there were some revolutions that were celebrated. So think about the tyrannicides in Athens, for example, which Josh has written about, which was became a sort of touchstone for the Athenians, that they had overturned a tyrannical order and established what ultimately became a democracy. So what I think that shows is still can be understood in terms of the broader logic of the book, which is that in that case, it's really a question of, who sees their interests being served by that revolution. And, not everyone in Athens was happy with that. We have a text called The Old Oligarch where, they're not happy, or that we refer to as the old oligarch, who, disparage the democratic order and are not, clearly don't see their interests being served by it. But, I just wanted to kind of make that point that there was one line in the book that to many Greeks, revolution was an abomination. And I think that's broadly true, but there are exceptions, which of course that sentence leaves open. And I think it's important to remember them.
Yeah, I wanted to add too. I mean, we just ran an article yesterday on the last Roman king, which was the tyrant Tarquin, and I mean that kind of ended with rebellion and then a republic. So it's interesting to see that it's not always sort of in one direction, because I know a lot of times we do talk about democracies turning into tyranny. It's sometimes seeing interesting tyranny turning into a republic. Would you say, kind of going back to your point, Josh, that we know what justice is today? Are we debating it? How does this fit into our modern world?
Well, I personally think we should be debating it. I think as soon as people become absolutely convinced that they know what justice is, and they brook no debate about what it is, it's so clearly the truth that they have about it, that then it does, I think, justify a lot of potentially, what I see as potentially anyway, problematic behavior in order to achieve that just outcome. So I think that in a pluralistic society, that we have to accept that we do not have an agreement about what justice is. That different people can be convinced that they're that their idea is correct, but as soon as they think that it is imperative upon them to impose that correctness on others, then we're out of the world of debate and into the world of revolution. In order to bring about that progress. So I think that's really part of the real the question we have today is that are we marching progressively towards a clear conception of justice that we must all agree on, or are we going to continue to debate what it really means to have a just society?
I wonder if also in our current society, if some parts of the society feel that they do know what justice is and some don't, and then that's sort of part of the conflict. If it's as you say, I mean, it's not everybody's going to the same drumbeat at the moment. So,
I mean, just to pick up again something that it's a theme in the book, which is that, you know, one way around that sort of lack of complete consensus is to try to find at least a definition of justice and a constitutional order based on it that everyone can feel that they have a share in, even if it's not their idea of the perfect share. And so I think that's one of the important lessons for the book is that, you know, rather than sort of excluding everyone who doesn't fit the definition that you think should be held, you try to instead sort of bring them into an order, even if it's imperfect from each of their point of view. And in some way, that might be one lesson of the mixed constitution tradition, which did see its goal as trying to rule out revolution by stabilizing a constitutional order, as in the case of what Polybius thought had happened with Rome. But he saw it was fragile, and he foresaw that it would also, the Republic would eventually, he predicted, would eventually fall.
I think what's challenging today is that all of the ideas around mixed constitutionalism, like what Melissa was just describing, you know, as sort of the compromise that's at the heart of it, and which, you know, Josh has also been trying to sort of bring back this ideal of you know, that's how democracies work. We have to negotiate towards compromise. I think what's challenging is that our headwinds are still very much in this sort of progressive sense of history. And I don't even mean that in like the sort of common use of progressive as sort of, you know, to the left, but just a sense that, you know, we need to be getting somewhere. We need to be changing everything. And it's not as sort of utopian as it used to be. You know, I think Melissa's right that there's sort of this strong progressive moment, you know, in the 19th century with all these literal utopias. We kind of seem to be soft progressives now. We just sort of expect everything to get better, and we don't even really describe it or talk about it very clearly. It almost seems to be just sort of these intuitions. You know, the new iPhone should be faster than the old iPhone, and you know, we should be, you know, making all these improvements in education and society and medical care. But I think that really often then goes against the kind of compromises and like everybody's feeling that they're seeing in the political system that Melissa's describing. You know, now when we look at Congress and they're not doing a lot, we decry gridlock. We say that's terrible. Like they can't get anything done in Congress. Whereas in fact, you know, from sort of classical perspective that, you know, people like Adams and Madison and others shared, like, yeah, that's kind of the point. You're not supposed to get that much done because it's going to be these difficult compromises. And if you start to do a lot, if you start to pass a lot of laws as Tacitus writes, you know, then that's a sign that the Republic is in real trouble.
Yeah, to go back to Melissa's point, I mean, I think this is one of the things that comes out strongly in Dan's book, is that if you get too much gridlock, if you feel you can't get anything done, then what ends up happening is you get a tyrant. You get somebody coming to the fore in the revolutionary group saying that there's too much debate, there's too much confusion, we're not really coalescing around a single vision any longer. What we really have to have is that single vision. And so the tyrant comes forward. So I think one of the questions then is tyranny an interruption in a constitutional or some kind of a notion that sort of anti-revolutionary, longue durée, or is tyranny the necessary means of going forward into that future? So I think once again, the ancient way of thinking about things, the Polybian way, is that tyrants are an interruption. You don't want a tyrant. Sometimes you get one, and if you do get one, then you have to, as Melissa says, you have to have a change that gets the tyrant out of the way. But getting the tyrant out of the way then allows you to go back to, or at least imaginatively go back to, a rule of ourselves, the citizenry in the community.
Now, you guys have mentioned a few times Constitution, and I think it's important to kind of go into constructs that have been used in the past. And so what kind of institutional features have been used to sort of temper revolutionary pressure without stifling reform? And are there any that would be applicable now? I mean, and again, maybe Melissa, you could start us off, because I know you sort of brought up some of that point previously.
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned this idea of a mixed constitution, which Dan talks about in the book, and it's this idea that rather than having a kind of oscillation and risk of an oligarchic regime in the Greek context, so the rule of the rich basically, and then being resisted by the rule of the many who were poor by comparison to the rich, and just having an oscillation between those two forces. And so the idea of a mixed constitution is that each of those groups has a kind of specific share and role. And Dan has a great discussion in the book of how that idea was still, in many ways, it was a classical ideal that is still appealed to during the American Revolution in particular, and the work of John Adams and also others. And so the Americans are really the last of the plebeians in that sense. But I would say also from my own studies of Plato, something broader, which is Plato in two works, at least in the Laws and in what may or may not be by Plato called the Seventh Letter, but a work sort of written in the Platonic school and spirit. But in both of these works, he talks at one point in very chilling terms about what happens if you have sort of a scorched earth policy as a political party, or not a party in our modern sense, but as a group of people who sort of are victorious in political struggle within any kind of constitution. And he says in both of those passages, he says, if the winners think that once they're in office, what they're going to do is try to make it impossible for the losers or their descendants to ever have a share in office, that's from Laws, Book 4, then you're just going to have a regime which is a faction regime and not an actual constitutional regime, because the other party kind of loses its sense that it can have any share in the future. And that is a breeding ground for revolution. So I think it's that kind of spirit of constitutional participation, give and take, turn taking, respecting the rules of the game, accepting that your opponents are legitimate. I think all of that is really crucial for any kind of constitutional structure to succeed.
It's worth saying that on Plato is that Plato, I think, was very much an original thinker in many ways, but I think in one sense he was quite conventional, and that is in seeing tyranny as a kind of non-regime, as the antithesis of any kind of constitutionality, as any kind of rule by laws. And that's really, I think, what the mixed constitution tries to do. I mean, it tries to prevent tyranny by the individual tyrant, but also tyranny by any faction, by any group, tyranny by the rich, tyranny by those who are in the majority. And so basically says that power, when it is unbalanced, when it's entirely in the hands of one faction or one individual, is inevitably going to be destructive and bad. And so this gets to the very point of why you have a mixed regime, as Dan was saying. You want to slow things down. You want to stop power from doing its wicked business, because once it's all in the hands of one faction, the business will be wicked.
think it's interesting that on top of the sort of thinking about constitutionalism as sort of the division of offices, the sort of how do you sort of set up the infrastructure of the state? A lot of these thinkers are also very interested in what is the civic culture that must necessarily accompany any arrangement, any constitutional arrangement for it to last. And so Plato's very, Melissa's written, very eloquently about this. There's also, I think, in Polybius, especially the end of Book 6, which doesn't get as much attention as the first part of Book 6, but he's really interested in what are all of the customs, like the funeral customs of the Romans, and some does a sort of comparative constitutional study, but it's very much on the cultural foundations of these states. And I mean, I think that there's a way in which this really leads into what, early modern political theorists sort of still to some degree talk about as classical republicanism, that it's about how you set up the state, but also really how do you design sort of an educational model? How do you create institutions that are going to keep this going over time?
And it's worth pointing out, I think, that building on Dan's point, that there is at least one important thinker in this whole tradition who is Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, who wants to say, actually, in order to do that foundational culture forming work, you actually shouldn't use force and can't use force. It's going to be sort of counterproductive. So this is research I've been doing this year on the figure of the lawgiver, and which is obviously in kind of dialectic with the theme of revolution. And what Rousseau wants to say is that the lawgiver, and he gives the example of people like Moses, Muhammad, as well as like Lycurgus, Solon, and other Greek figures. These figures, actually, we should think of them as using persuasion and sort of culture forming means to get people to have common festivals, common games, common religious practices. But actually, violence is kind of going to be antithetical to that. Now, not everyone agreed with him, and certainly the way his ideas are taken up by some of the thinkers in the French Revolution, they don't maintain that sort of persuasion versus force dichotomy. But I think it's an interesting fact that Rousseau kind of aligns that culture forming not with violence, in contrast to Machiavelli, for example.
Now, Melissa, that's very violence from the top down, like from the lawgiver. But is it ever possible to have violence justified from the people, from the revolutionaries and the rebellions? And do the ancients sort of give us any ideas on how we could make that moral calculation?
I mean, yeah, well, I was going to appeal to some of Josh's work, so I'll just say a word and then he should answer. But, this is where I was thinking so much about the Athenian accounts of overthrowing the tyrants in the late 6th century, and the accounts afterwards. And Josh wrote a wonderful piece called I Besieged That Man, about how there's a kind of popular engagement in that overthrow. We shouldn't just assign it to the leaders of that, the so-called leaders who sort of emerge from that. But again, I think this is a really difficult area to know how to give moral guidelines. This is why the dialectic between Machiavelli and Rousseau and Nietzsche and other thinkers on this point is so challenging for us, I think, to contemplate, because there's a sense in which we know violence has happened in some of these past revolutions that have in the end achieved a kind of popular legitimacy. I would say, well, one way to look at that is is the logic sort of towards more inclusion? So are you overthrowing a regime that was more limited, more tyrannical, more expropriative, and are moving towards a dimension of greater participation? But it's an imperfect process, and not everyone is always going to be ultimately included. So I don't think it's easy to set moral guidelines. This is where kind of Kant famously looked at the French Revolution and couldn't have justified the French Revolution ex ante according to his moral principles, but sort of famously raised a glass to it, kind of, as it were, in its aftermath, thinking that once it had happened, it was in some way symbolizing the possibility of kind of positive political change, even though it wasn't something he could have prescribed morally should have been done. And I think that encapsulates the kinds of tensions in thinking about this.
Yeah, just briefly, I think that one of the questions is when there is a violent revolution, the question is, who is it a revolution against? So for the Athenians, it was either against the tyrant, and that is you just get rid of the tyrant and then you go back to the better time when we rule ourselves, or it's against a foreign opponent. The Spartans come in basically to impose a kind of tyranny, and so then they can rise up against the Spartans and feel that the revolution was not against some internal. It's not a civil war against ourselves. It's against this intrusion. I think similarly, the American Revolution is against a foreign, or now understood as a foreign power, right? The King of England has shown himself to be hostile to the Americans, and so therefore it is us, the Americans, against a foreign power. One of the, I think, frightening things about a lot of modern revolutions, starting with the French Revolution, is it's a revolution against ourselves. It becomes a revolution of one class or part of the populace against another class or part of the populace. And that keeps on going because the logic is there are always internal enemies because we don't get to utopia fast enough. Why aren't we getting to utopia? Because the internal enemies are continuing to impede our progress, and therefore they have to be eliminated. So I think the logic of the enemy within is really part of the sort of terror of a lot of the.
You mentioned the enemy within, and I mean that's kind of leads perfectly to the next question. That we've seen this sort of schisms that happen within revolutions, and maybe Dan, you could start us off on this one because it is interesting that just to say that we get to span all of antiquity all the way to modernity. So we don't always get to do that in classical wisdom. So I appreciate the opportunity when we can. But yeah, what is the likelihood of schisms? Why would you kind of get this duality happening in these revolutionary moments?
So I'd preface this by saying that I don't necessarily think that these what I'd call sort of the modern progressive revolutions are always more violent than earlier ones. The American Revolution was incredibly violent, not just against the British, but even sort of against other loyalists. But it is, as Josh was saying, it's like who is the violence directed against? And what does make the French Revolution quite different than the Americans is in the words of the Girondin politician Vergniaud, the revolution like Saturn devours its children. So you get the revolutionaries turning against themselves. And I think, as Josh was saying, I mean, it does seem to be part of this dynamic. If you've given up on the pluralist belief that we're going to have to negotiate these things, we're going to have to debate them, and if instead you've got this clear vision of where society is headed, and as Dostoevsky caricatures it in The Possessed, there can be only one solution to the social problem, and it is mine, as Shugyalov says. That really is sort of, I think, the modern revolutionary mindset that there's one solution. If you disagree with me, you're not just wrong, you are now a counter-revolutionary, and therefore you must be eliminated. And because the truth is, as Josh was saying, like we don't get to utopia fast enough. People form different opinions. We don't miraculously reach this consensus around justice and reason that had been promised by the modern prophets of progress. And so I would say like the sort of the splintering we see is inevitable. It's just sort of, human nature that we don't all agree on everything. But in a revolutionary context where there can be only one solution, there can only be one future towards which we are headed, that's a problem that is almost invariably met with violence.
I'll just throw in an anecdote to illustrate the point, which isn't in the book, but it would have fit in very well, which is Karl Popper reflects, and I think in his autobiography, on growing up in Vienna, toward at the end of the First World War, when there's a short-lived revolution in Vienna, and he says that what sort of shocks him is seeing the revolutionaries dragging somebody off, to be executed, and he realizes that the problem is that you can't sort of test the hypothesis that they're acting on. There's no way to kind of test and see whether that can be refuted, and that actually is the germ of his philosophy of science, which is that we have to be able to, something. So Marxism, which was the basis for the revolution that he was witnessing, in his view, was a kind of unrefutable, untestable theory, and therefore wasn't a sort of proper scientific theory at all. And so I think it's another anecdote that fits into Dan's kind of overall story.
I'd like to turn to Josh for a second, and sort of address some of the ideas that you worked on over the years about Athenian democracy, and how sort of well-matched institutions can unleash civic energy without it kind of going into sort of chaos. How does that sort of fit in with the sort of historical arc that Dan is presenting? And do you think that this is something that we should be addressing with regards to our current culture and its views on democracy and popular leaders?
I tend to think that democracy is a really good thing. It gives us a lot of things that I think we want, and what I believe we should want that is a kind of baseline equality, a kind of baseline political freedom, liberty, and a chance to express our basic human capacities for use of reason, use of argument, communication towards pro-social ends. So, and it gives us all the chance to do that if it's a really inclusive democracy. So I think that's a good thing. But democracy's hard. I think that's something that we often tend to forget. Because we think it's good, we often want it to be easy, but it's really not. And it really is, I think, a matter of getting the balance right, getting the balance between social inequality, which I take to be ultimately we're incapable of eliminating social inequality for reasons we could go into, but I don't think it's possible to ever have a society in which everybody is fully equal to everybody else in every parameter, right? Just as wise, just as capable, just as well off, and so on. So if we say that there's social inequalities of various sorts are ineliminable, but we want to have political equality so that we all have a say. We're going to have to get the institutions right. We're going to have institutions whereby we can debate and deliberate, whereby we can actually make judgments, whereas those who are more powerful or capable or able are not simply going to dominate the rest of us. Where those of us who are superior in number are not just going to say, well, we'll just outvote you and crush you down because we can. So in Athens, there was a lot of experimentation. I think they did get it reasonably right within the frame of a slave society that didn't give power to women and all kinds of things that we would now say were just we would not live with. But as an ancient democracy, I think they did figure out some of the institutional problems, and they did it in the background context of the social norms, the things that Melissa was talking about in terms of background culture. But I think we just really do need to once again recognize how hard it is to do that, and that it takes continued work by citizens to do the work of democracy. And it's therefore up to all of us to try to sustain, create and sustain background culture as well as the constitutional legal order that makes that all possible.
Well, I think that segues very nicely, actually, to my next question, which is more for Melissa, because you've already sort of hinted at this previously with regards to sort of having a civic culture. and the importance of that. And you've written about this over the years, about Plato and Aristotle linking civic education to constitutional stability. And it's interesting. A lot of people like talking about politics these days, but not really about civics. So do we have a way to cultivate kind of these ideas of civic culture and the virtues that we need to restrain revolutionary excess? I mean, how do we kind of create these philosophical guardrails?
Yeah, I mean, I have been thinking about this a lot. It's a very challenging moment to be thinking about it. I think I want to kind of go to the other side. So, sometimes one can approach it from the side of philosophy, but I want to take a leaf out of some of Josh's past work as well and say, it's actually kind of in a Tocquevillian sense through that sort of local level participation and engagement. And I think it's really giving meaning and local teeth to the idea of accountability. So I think people have to feel that not only do their kind of virtues and contributions matter, but also that they can hold people accountable when they are acting wrongly. And those accountability institutions for the ancient Greeks in Athens and also in the other democracies and non-democratic institutions were as important as kind of legislative participation or judicial participation in making the Constitution sort of meaningful. So, some examples of that are perhaps, we've had the idea of citizens juries for thinking about policy changes, but you could also have citizen juries that would actually be able to ask questions of elected officials that the elected officials had to answer. So sort of Sabina-like powers, but not just for congressional committees or special prosecutors, but also for sort of randomly selected groups of ordinary people. Those kinds of ideas, I think people, are increasingly feeling powerless and kind of that they don't know how they can make a difference. And I think there's a kind of positive dialectic between institutions and culture. So, they can sort of piggyback on each other. And if you can set up, even at a very local level, institutions that engage people meaningfully, then that can kind of piggyback into a sense of greater efficacy and greater commitment and participation.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I recall one time studying with regards to sort of Athenian democracy that the citizens would be able to at times write the agenda of what the people would discuss. And I mean, to me, being able to write the agenda, to be able to say, no, this is the topic we're going to talk about, would be a huge power of influence that I think in modern politics seems to be more done by like lobbyists, but then, there's obviously problems with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I was just going to say that the agenda setting authority is absolutely key to any kind of political power. If I set the agenda and the rest of you get to vote, and if I say, well, what we're going to vote about is, the color of the coffee urn in the staff, then so go ahead, democratically debate it and vote it. But meanwhile, I'll run the department as I choose. Then we obviously don't have a democracy. So yes, in Athens, the agenda is set by a lotteried group of 500 citizens who serve for a year on the council. And the council's primary function is setting the agenda for the citizen assembly. The agenda power is huge.
If I could just add something here about civic education, both in classical times and maybe something for today too, is just remembering the importance of historical study. That in a sense, like how do we remind people like that democracy is hard, that these are things that, if you don't sort of accept that fact, you end up with tyrants. Well, one way to sort of remember and remind students of all of this is through the study of the past. And I think it's interesting that that's also, built into this tradition. Thucydides writes the history, for those who would like to, through a knowledge of the past, be better, leaders for the future. This sort of prudential tradition is also key, perhaps especially key for the political leaders, but must be built into any form of civic education.
Yeah, entirely agreed. I mean, we've been, Dan and I at Stanford have been working hard on trying to rebuild a commitment to civic education as, part of the fundamental responsibility of every university. And I think certainly a knowledge of the past, or at least of certain parts of the past, is imperative to that. If we say there's nothing to be learned from the past, then it's just up to our wild imaginations of what the future might be. And then if our wild imaginations fasten on to a utopian dream of justice, then off we are into I think, the scary parts of
I was going to say, Dan, when you were making the point about the need for learning history, I was like, I don't think you could find a panelist wanting to nod more in agreement. We're like, yes, yes, everyone, can I scream it from the mountaintops? Like, this is important, but it's interesting and it's valuable and it will help us. So yes, certainly in agreement. And I want to then address another point, that this is something that, again, we see in our modern world and we see in the ancient world, and that is narratives. And this is something that is used and deployed. The term propaganda, of course, is a very modern term, but the action of it is not at all. So seeing how important it is, and this is something like, as somebody who follows a lot of American politics but is rarely in America, I can see the same story being presented completely differently, again and again and again. And I'm sure people are very aware of that, and it's almost horrifying, because you're like, how can we find out what's actually happening? Because it can change so dramatically depending on who's writing about it. So how can we use, knowing that, is there a way that narratives can be help for moderation? I mean, how has it been sort of used in the past as well, from antiquity into modernity? And being just aware of that, does that help?
I mean, I think that it is just the case that historical narratives are deeply complex. Herodotus, was sometimes called the father of history, makes a point of saying frequently throughout his histories, well, these people say one thing about what happened. These other people say a different thing about what happened. There are multiple stories. And so I think part of what it takes to use history for democratic purposes is realizing that there are, in fact, different understandings of the past, and they're not mutually exclusive. American constitutional order, or the American Constitution, was indeed, in some ways, we look back on it and say, gosh, they did something quite wicked. They allowed for slavery to continue. Okay, that's part of the narrative, at least from where we now sit. On the other hand, you can look back and say, that was the best agreement they could have gotten. If they didn't make a compromise on that, there wouldn't have been a United States. They could have broken up into multiple squabbling factions. It would not have remained independent, given the hostility of European powers. So, yeah, which is true. That was the only, the best bargain available, or that it is a bargain that we look back on and say it was regrettable. Well, they're both true. If you don't have a chance as a student, student of history, to take into account both of those things, then you're going to be missing out. And that means, we have to do history right. We have to do history as not a simple narrative in which there are heroes and wicked people, and the heroes sometimes win and sometimes the wicked people win. It makes for a great story. But I think we do have to recognize that a lot of the things that are really important about history come about because because of compromises, and because these compromises are invariably imperfect from the point of view even of those who are striking them. And yet without them, we won't be able to go on together into any kind of a future.
And I think just to also go back to some of the themes of the book, one of the challenges of history is kind of that it can also lead you astray. So, one of the themes of the book, I think, is that, people in the French Revolution thought they were being ancient Romans, and, there's all kinds of funny stories about them sort of, adopting names and dressing up, not just Romans, but, also Greeks, and kind of imagining themselves to be these great heroes of antiquity. And so I think learning from history is challenging precisely because no two situations are ever exactly the same. And so the challenge is really, to sort of figure out how to weigh the differences also. So for example, like when one thinks about the present moment, one of my colleagues at Princeton, Kim Shepley, who's a legal scholar and sociologist, has pointed out that, in the past, many authoritarian regimes, we think of them as sort of just breaking the law. And she's documented that there's now many patterns of authoritarian regimes today where they're finding new creative ways to use the law, sort of weaponize the law. So that's an example where you might sort of think, oh, well, we're okay because they're not breaking the law, or, they're having elections. But if you have elections in a way where people don't have recourse to all the protections that free and fair elections would need, then you're not really. So I think it's just a point to say it's certainly we need history, but we also need to realize that, learning from history is itself a kind of art and skill, and, requires judgment.
I think there's also an interesting, like almost flip side to all this, which are the narratives about the future. And so that's something that, really kicks off sort of in the modern era, where suddenly like so many people are telling these stories about the future. And it is kind of fascinating how literature, almost more than political theory, becomes the preferred genre for this, because you can fire up the imagination and you can really harness the sort of the full range of narrative potential by weaving a good yarn about what's to come. And I think, that's in a way almost, more powerful and thus more dangerous than competing accounts about the past, which have similar features, of course, as Melissa and Josh mentioned, but sort of the way, and I think we see this today, sort of the way in which people tell stories about where we're headed, either some kind of terrible catastrophe if we don't intervene immediately, and have a Caesar instead of a president, things like that.
I think one of the great things that I learned from Dan's book was how important it was for revolutionaries of the 19th century, 20th century, looking back on the French Revolution. They took that history as the right one, but it had to be interpreted in the right way. What went right, what went wrong becomes part of the playbook for future revolutionaries. So yeah, I hadn't really ever thought about how really important that bit of history really was to the bit of history that is the French Revolution was to the subsequent history of modernity.
Yeah, it's always been very fascinating to see how history has been used and employed. And, as we were saying before, to see right now that the media can be so different between determining by who is saying it, shows you that when you're reading a book in history, you're like, well, who wrote who wrote this version? It's kind of hard to know, even in the past, what really happened. So we're kind of always investigating and always trying to find the political ideas and the literary evidence and the archaeological evidence to kind of paint a full picture, because it is difficult just having the story or the narrative. Now, I do want to make sure we have time for audience questions, and I've seen that there's been quite a few really interesting ones already. But I will say I want to do one last question for our panelists before we get into it, and I like to kind of end with a little bit more positive note. So, if possible, would you be able to assign one ancient work to every citizen in our society today? If you could, which would you choose, and which revolutionary or anti-revolutionary wisdom would you want to impart?
Well, I can start. Then I'm going to say surprise everyone, I think, because you would expect me to say Plato, and on another day I might say Plato. But I actually have just been on a kind of weekend with a group in Syracuse reading in part Xenophon's dialogue called The Hero, which is about Hiero. So it's a proper name, not hero as in. And this is actually kind of an amazing work because it's diagnosing the structural flaws in being a tyrant that actually make a tyrant incapable of attaining the happiness that they think that their tyranny will bring, because a tyrant can't trust anyone, they can't truly have friends, they can't enjoy, they can't go out without their bodyguards, they can't travel safely. And I mean, actually, Plato's Republic 9 makes very similar points, but The Hero is very interesting because it puts that insight into the mouth of a tyrant himself. So it's the tyrant himself who's saying, you think I'm the happiest of men, but actually, and I think this is a really important work because it gets to the heart of that. What is it that people might be aspiring to and aspiring to power? Is it so for the people who are going to make, who might be tempted to make the kind of anti-democratic revolutions, as it were, is it really true that aspiring to that kind of structural inequality and unequal power is something that is humanly satisfying? And if that's not so, then I think it opens the door to a more positive and inclusive kind of politics.
I'll say that take a fairly traditional great book. The Hero is a really interesting text, but I'll say Thucydides. Thucydides writes the one work, History of the Peloponnesian War, and it is both a narrative and a very profound, I think, theoretical take on power, on change, on human action, on leadership. So I recently got to do a full-term course on Thucydides with mostly students from interested in international relations. It was sort of transformative, I think, for some of them. They'd all read bits of Thucydides, but they'd never read Thucydides right through, slowly, carefully. It gives you, I think, a lot of the insights that it can kick off a book like Dan's, from Thucydides to Lenin. And I think there's reason to start with Thucydides.
Yeah, I think of Thucydides kind of as the Proust of the ancient world, that everything's in there. But since Josh took Thucydides, I guess I'd make a plug for Polybius. I think he's one of the overlooked ancient thinkers. He's writing at this sort of funny time, a Greek writing at the pinnacle of Roman imperial power. But Polybius is also a great historian. I mean, his account of the Punic Wars is, in and of itself, leaving aside Book 6, which is sort of what I focused on, but kind of an amazing study. In some ways, almost like the first global history, in the sense of really trying to understand how things that are happening in different parts of this Mediterranean world are interconnected. And just an incredible narrative power also. But of course, Book 6, I think if anyone who cares about U.S. constitutionalism, about things like the separation of powers, which are unfortunately again in the news and again being debated, really should go back and sort of read what Polybius has to say about how it all works. Sort of going back to what Melissa was saying, the mixed constitution is this sort of ingenious piece of technology. And I think we need to sort of remind ourselves of where it comes from and how it's supposed to work, if we want to keep it.
All right, everybody, you've got your reading list. Start distributing it at your local schools. We've got no, but I genuinely think it's so wonderful that we can try to encourage and cultivate just even the discussion about what this, the idea of civics, the idea of constitutions, democracies, tyranny, because it is, you know, frankly, a moment when people kind of toss around these terms haphazardly, I fear, and it can have a reaction, and it's not what we need to do is be able to have conversations and to be able to have dialogues in order to preserve good constitutional systems and so that we can all get along. But I want to get to some of these questions now. So this one from Stone Chen is a great question, and really perhaps I should have started the whole event, kicked it off with, and been a bit more like Socrates and defined your terms, because it goes, how do you define a revolution? And in what aspects is a revolution different from a revolt or rebellion or a civil war? The Civil War aspect of the English Revolution, for example, always seems more prominent in scholarly discourse. The Mexican Revolution, too, is sometimes cited as a mere civil war. At times, we like to highlight continuity pre- and post-revolution and downplay the idea of abrupt change. How should we draw the line on whether an event constitutes revolutionary changes? Maybe Dan should kick this off, since you've kind of had to string it that as your thread through the book.
Yeah, so I mean, I think actually it's useful here going back to the ancient Greek terms. And for instance, one of the things that's helpful in sort of Greek terminology is that they have two different words for different aspects of what we now just call revolution. One is stasis, which is, you know, the fighting in the streets, the violence, the disruption, the things we sort of associate with the outward signs of revolution. But then they also have metabole, which is really regime change. So when you move from an oligarchy to a democracy or vice versa. And so, you know, from that Greek perspective, you can have one without the other. You could have stasis but no metabole, or you could have metabole without stasis. And I think that's actually kind of helpful for thinking today about, you know, sometimes you have the sound and the fury of revolution without actually the outcome of a regime change. And of course, sometimes you can have these sort of silent revolutions where the regime has changed without there being fighting in the streets. So I think it's just, you know, that I always joke that I don't want to like become the revolution police instead of say, oh, sorry, that's not a revolution. You know, there are a lot of things that are kind of like revolution-like, or they have partial revolutions, and I don't think we gain that much by having, you know, clear lines. But I would also encourage the questioner to look at this great article by David Armitage called "Every Revolution is a Civil War," which thinks really about that connection and why, as David points out, indeed, almost every revolution includes at some point or another a civil war.
There was a request in the comments to reiterate the Greek terms. Would you be able to just say them one more time or write them down?
So I can put it in the chat, actually. The other one was metabole.
Perfect.
Yeah, I just put it in actually, so it's there.
And there's another one just to kind of add that. How did the Russian Revolution change the thought of revolution?
So I think that the Russian Revolution is, in many respects, it's sort of the fulfillment of the modern progressive revolutionary current that starts with the French, right? So as Josh was referring to earlier, I mean, it's almost comical the way in which at the you know, in 1917 the Bolsheviks are sort of like thumbing through their history of the French Revolution. It's like, okay, what comes next? Oh, Revolutionary Tribunal. All right, who's going to be? I mean, there's this quote from Lenin, like, who will be my Fouquier-Tinville, which was the name of the prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal in France. So it does sort of very much start as taking the script of the French Revolution, but then it plays out for much longer than the French Revolution ever did. And I think what then you start to see are these other aspects of the modern progressive revolution, including what I call sort of the rise of the Red Leviathan, sort of essentially the tyrant, but who does arise sort of as Josh was referring to earlier, really to sort of solve a problem in in the revolutionary politics, which is that once you have gotten rid of pluralism and debate as a means for determining the correct way forward, you almost just need somebody who's going to be, who will have the authority to say, okay, it's going to be this, right? It's going to be not going to be the new economic policy anymore. Instead, we're going to, start socializing land, which is sort of the debate after Lenin's death. Which one should it be? Like, there's not really a right answer, but you need someone to decide. And so that's, I think, the new model that comes into the foreground with the Russian Revolution. Not immediately, but by the 1930s, that's become the new script.
Can I just add a word about the meaning of the word revolution? Because I don't know if it came across as much today as it does in the book, that we can think in the way we use English today that there are two very different meanings of revolution. So one is like if you think the earth revolves around the sun, right? So that's revolution as a circular movement. And as opposed to the way we think of revolution politically, which is a kind of violent rupture in the modern sense, leading to this radical changed future. And the point that Dan makes in the book is that the circular movement sense was actually came into the language through the translations of Polybius in the early modern period for another Greek word that he didn't mention that I'll put in the chat in a minute, which is anakuklosis, which literally means going in a circle. So that's actually where you get these two very different senses of revolution. One is this kind of, circular sense that, well, things might change locally for a time. You might have something one day and something different the next day, but eventually it'll all kind of go into a cycle, versus this sort of more linear movement.
That sort of leads on to very nicely to one of the other questions, which was, can you consider the dynamics and relationship of evolution with that of revolution? So was there ever that in the Greek, the idea of evolution as well?
I think there is a conception that things do change, and that the world is now different in a way that is sort of in some way systematic, from the way the world was in the deep past. So Thucydides, for example, talks about how in the deep past, the Greek world was very underpopulated and very impoverished, compared to the quite densely populated and much more prosperous world that he lived in. So they certainly recognized that there was change over time, that things had happened in perhaps an evolutionary kind of way. But that's quite different then from the notion of revolution, which means that you ultimately aren't really getting any sort of permanent change in any directional kind of way. You simply go around and around, as Melissa was saying. So I think there is the conception that of change over time, in a way that is understandable, but it's quite different from this idea that true change requires a great break in the way the world is now, and that it is the responsibility of the revolutionary to create that break in order to move forward to imagine.
And one thing I think it's worth pointing out is that the classic, the ancients did have this idea of progress in a sense, as Josh was just describing. It's in Thucydides. Lucretius has this incredibly long, anthropology of how did we get to the point we are. So they realized that it wasn't like poles all the way down. There's a story here, but the big difference is that they don't project that into the future. So at the end of Lucretius's long description of how did we get the arts and how did we get politics and cities and walls, etc. It's like, and now we're at our cruising altitude. Like, there's not really this sort of whole other advancement that's going to happen. And I think that's really, it's going to take until the 18th century that you start to get thinkers like, oh wait, we could continue this story. The progress could keep going.
I wonder if like nice visualization of these two perspectives on how history moves. You know, you kind of have the straight line of progress, and then the sort of cyclical style of constant revolution is to have sort of like spiral, you know, the way that the planets actually move as they're like shooting away from a center point, and they're sort of corkscrewing into history, into space. I mean, I kind of feel like we have this, both the cyclical and the progressive, kind of simultaneously. But I don't know if that mentality helps or hinders. Um, but here's a question specifically for you, Dan, and maybe Josh and Melissa, you also have experience with this. But the question is, I would love to hear about the choice to write a book ranging from antiquity to modernity. It seems like the range of research tends to become shorter and shorter in academia, and that you guys at Stanford Humanities are an anomaly. Which is as much, which is very needed. But I guess, was it difficult to kind of do that whole range?
I mean, it was fun because I got to learn so much. Um, and I will say, like, I didn't set out to do this. It was kind of there was a sort of a oh shit moment where I realized that I'm gonna have to go back and, start to tell this story, across such a large range of time. But yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly kind of going to depend on temperament, but I find it much more exciting to be always, a student. As I said, this, a key moment of this book happened when I was, a student again in Josh's class and learning, and I've sort of carried that attitude forward. Part of writing this book also involved, actually learning ancient Greek, which really put me back in my position as a beginner student. And I don't know, I feel like maybe that, for me at least, if I wasn't always a student and learning something new, I think I would find it kind of boring. But we can't hear
A
you.
specific question, sorry. With regards to the American Revolution, did the insurgents about shout the British are coming, or did they shout the redcoats are coming? There is a difference.
Well, so in 1775, there was no sense among the American colonists that they weren't British. They were very proud of being British. And I think that's one of the reasons why, the war starts before they even declare independence, right? They're in this sort of civil war at first, and they're very hesitant to give up on their British identity because they really believe that that's like the best you could do in this modern Western world if you were British. There was very much that sense that only the British had figured out freedom, and they even had French people like Montesquieu telling them this, so they were very proud of it. And so I think it's one of the key parts of this story is like, how did the Americans eventually give up on their British identity, and did they too? I think there's this great book by Eric Nelson, called The Royalist Revolution, that says, there was sort of this moment where, they're like, yeah, down with, George III, but that passes pretty quickly, and we end up with a president who looks a lot like a king. And indeed, even the structure of the U.S. government bears a lot in common with the old English Constitution. My favorite part of the Declaration of Independence is where, it's a sort of Dear John letter to the king, but then one of the things that they accuse him of is not respecting English common law. And that sort of shows like where their identity lies, I think. And there are some of the early state declarations, I believe it's Delaware and Maryland, that in the declaration itself, it says, and by the way, we're keeping all the English common law. So the extent to which they even give up on their British identity is debatable.
I think it would be really interesting to sort of study how revolution is so identity forming, and that it's an important construct. And I'm thinking, going back to the Russian Revolution, the sorry, going back to the War of 1812, which I'm just thinking is not actually quite a revolution, but I was thinking of that Orlando Figg's book on Natasha's dance, and how the Russians had always had this sort of idea of being sort of French and cosmopolitan, and then they really had to embrace and find about what in their culture was Russian. And so that's such an important path, I guess, to nation building.
Another fun fact from another book of Orlando Figes is that the one new thing about the Russian Revolution is that the Bolsheviks started wearing leather jackets, and that became part of the iconography of revolution, and that's introduced with the Bolsheviks, for what it's worth.
Well, it'd be interesting just to see, like, yeah, the imagery, the symbolism that it's so integral to these movements. Now I know we're kind of running out of our time limit, and everybody's been our guests, panelists have been so gracious with their time, and I unfortunately could tell it's a Thursday night and somebody's starting club music somewhere on the island. But I do want to finish with sort of maybe a thought experiment question, which is one supplied by one of the members of the audience, which is, what do you think AI will say about history?
Anybody who can answer that question in a definitive way will, I think, be proved a liar. Since I think the thing we really don't know about AI is what will it be. It is also already something that is very different from what it was 6 months ago, much less 3 years ago. So I'll lead off by saying I have no clue, and I'm going to be very suspicious about anybody who says that they actually do know what it's going to be. But I'd be very interested in hearing Melissa's and Dan's opinions about what it might be.
I mean, actually, Josh, where you started made me think we should say maybe AI is the ultimate Cretan liar paradox, because I mean, one of the sort of, really scary things, and it will be interesting to see structurally whether it can be eliminated, is its tendency to hallucinate. And so, that sort of dimension where, you really, there's sort of no restriction on sort of generating falsehoods, I think is because of plausibility, because of what we think we know. I mean, it's a really fascinating dynamic, and I think it will be, yeah. But that does seem to be a kind of threat to history, where plausibility overtakes kind of historical evidence and reality.
I think what I'm finding, because as Josh said, I'm also just sort of trying to keep up and understand right now where it is, and I have very little sense of where it will be. But one thing that does seem to be emerging, and maybe this will disappear, or it could become even more pronounced, is that AI, I think, is going to be very different for different people. So, for instance, just to give an example, you could put anything into AI as a prompt. You could say, how did the Egyptians influence the Russian Revolution? And it'll probably come up with some answer, because that's sort of how it's designed, at least currently with the LLMs. It's always there to find connections, and that's where you really run the risk of these hallucinations that Melissa is talking about. But I've started to use it to help me find bibliographical sources, like, what are some good books on this topic? And, there's lots of ways you can do that, and I'm just sort of playing around. But I actually find it's pretty helpful when you're sort of targeting it, and you sort of the quality of the prompt is going to determine a lot the quality of the output. But I worry most of the time. I worry, and especially about the effects of AI on our students.
Yeah, I can't, I'm not in academia, so I can't imagine what it's like for professors these days. I do not envy you trying to navigate teaching with AI. I don't know if you guys have stumbled upon any good tips you want to put out there for your fellow professors, but teachers.
It's I imagine a possible future. You going back to your question, Anya, about what will AI say about the history of the past. And at least one way to imagine it is that the AI will be saying, once upon a time, in a kind of a Lucretian early time, one set of the biological organisms actually imagined us, the AIs, as tools. How funny is that? Fill in
I
the
do
rest of
think
it as you
so,
will.
it's also possible, that, I think we're still not really at Gen AI. I mean, in the sense that like the AI is not thinking; it's just stringing words together, and I think it's will we ever get there? That to me is actually an open question. I'm not sure that the AI hype is necessarily to be believed. I mean, I'm not a computer scientist, so I'm not saying it's true or not, but I think it's worth asking ourselves, maybe it won't be true.
Well, I think this is probably a conversation that was getting a bit out of our league, or at least mine. Though I am mostly worried about the extinction, I think, when they create algorithms to break down systems and structures that we have become completely reliant on. So I think it's a good time to return to the classics, get back to the basics, and study, a bit of Thucydides. And so with that note, I think I will thank everybody. You can see I've got the sun kind of glaring in my eye now, and I'm regretting my choice of sitting outside. But I want to say thank you so much, Josh, Dan, and Melissa, for joining us today. It's been incredibly insightful. Dan, your book, The Revolution to Come, A History of an Idea from Thucydides to Lenin, was really interesting, very thought-provoking, and I highly encourage everybody to check it out, and I'll follow it up with links to your book, Dan, as well as to Josh and Melissa's excellent work as well. You guys have contributed a lot in this space, and it's genuinely an honor to get to speak with you today and to share your wisdom and insights with the classical wisdom community. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to Sean for helping out as well. And thank you, as always, to our wonderful classical wisdom community. You guys rock. I love your questions and your enthusiasm and your interest, and it's just beautiful to see that the love of classics. I keep saying the classics are coming back. It's happening. So with that, I'll say goodbye to everybody and have a wonderful, wonderful week.
Thank you,
Thank you
Anya.
so much. Thank you. Goodbye.